So let's get started. So welcome to Introduction to Historical Thinking with Dr. Lindsay Gibson. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Lindsay Gibson. He's not just an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum Pedagogy at the University of British Columbia, like it says on his slide, but he's one of Canada's preeminent scholars of historical thinking. And he's a co-applicant on the Thinking Historically for Canada's Future project that we learned about yesterday. And he leads the Teaching and Learning Research Cluster, which is overseeing the teacher and student surveys, among many other things. He also organizes the Historical Thinking Summer Institute with Canada's History Society, this year in online monthly virtual sessions. And most importantly for today's session, he's the author of many excellent classroom resources that we're going to, I think, learn a bit more about today.
That's the nicest intro I've ever had. Thanks.
Well, you're a pretty awesome guy, Lindsay. So.
Thanks. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming on a Saturday morning. I'm coming to you from Vancouver, from where UBC's, and I'm an assistant professor at UBC. Vancouver's campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkamaylan-speaking Musqueam people. I'm sure you've been thinking a lot about truth and reconciliation. We're in a very unique position as teachers and teacher educators to play an important role in this, and I really see historical thinking as playing a really key role in maybe getting towards truth, and maybe hopefully if we get there, maybe we can start working towards reconciliation. Now, we got this nice small group this morning, which is wonderful. It allows more time to chat. I apologize in advance for the fire hose approach to introducing historical thinking. It's a massive topic. We're going to try and kind of highlight some of the key aspects of it. And so our goals today are really to try and define it and think about its purposes and rationale. We're going to quickly describe the different concepts, but explain how to activate these concepts to teach and assess historical thinking. And hopefully identify some, not hopefully, but we plan on also introducing some resources that can be used for teaching and assessing historical thinking. Now, given the size of the group, I'm more than happy for you to stop me at any particular point to ask any questions or to make any comments or suggestions, hopefully from Jennifer and Rachel as well, who have vast expertise in social studies and history teaching and historical thinking. And also I posted, and I don't know if there's new people in the room can always see the previous chat, so maybe Jennifer can or Rachel can just repost it, but I have posted a Google Drive link to the PDF for this PowerPoint, but also one other document on key aspects of historical thinking concepts. And I can post as we go through. So let's just start with the definition and some rationale. So what we say is that if the past is everything that's ever happened, and history are the narratives that we tell from the present about the past, then we define historical thinking as the cognitive process of analyzing and interpreting historical evidence to construct, to deconstruct in some cases, and to reconstruct historical narratives. Okay, so it's the process by which we think about narratives, basically, right? And the stories that we are told or that we tell about history. Now, what are some of the rationales? Well, one of the big ones is that history is everywhere, and students are regularly encountering historical interpretations that require historical thinking in their daily lives. This week, I was doing a presentation with Seven Oaks teachers in Manitoba, and they had Pam Palmater present there, and she was talking about Canada's past and present and ongoing genocide. Well, some of the teachers were really struggling with this idea and thinking about it. And so that's a great example of a narrative, which I've posted on this idea from a conversation article, a narrative that requires historical thinking. We also know when we look around the world right now and look around Canada that we're facing level of political, economic, social, environmental, and cultural complexity that demands a critical understanding of the past in order to guide ethical actions and decisions in the present and future, whether that be COVID and anti-vax positions, whether that be monument, the struggle over commemoration, the ongoing and urgent threat of ongoing climate crisis and climate change, Fairy Creek, the largest act of civil disobedience in Canada's history. Now, another big rationale for historical thinking, as identified by one of our colleagues in the United States, Sam Weinberg, is that the internet has obliterated authority, right? In the sense that When old people like me were younger and were given school assignments, we went home and our source of information was the family set of encyclopedias, however old they are and however many missing editions there were. So, but things have really changed, right? I mean, the encyclopedia writing game, you had an editorial board, people would edit and review things. Well, now we know with the internet, blogs, et cetera, people are free to post what they want. So fake news is absolutely not new. However, maybe the level and amount of information that students are being barred with is maybe new, and the degree to which organizations and individuals are trying to deceive. So we think that historical thinking can really be valuable for thinking about the evidence and narratives that we're being confronted with. And the last major piece is all around students, is that we accept the fact that to teach math, you need to do math. To teach science, you need to do science. However, regularly when we think about history, students are oftentimes learning and dealing with the finished products of history, but are rarely being asked to do history themselves, to construct their own understandings, construct their own narratives, construct their own interpretations, analyzing evidence, all of these various pieces. So the next piece that I want to really talk about in terms of the rationale, if you think that the rationale for historical thinking is valid or not, is to really think about what are some key understandings that we want to have as foundational, as building blocks for students' historical understanding. And these essential understandings would be things that we would want to work with students to build their understanding with over time. So one of the essential pieces that we regularly ask, sorry, I just want to keep my eye on the chat as well. One of the questions that we regularly ask students to do, and it's a tremendous example of a question that you can ask in class, even though students have maybe not thought about this necessarily, that a good question can provoke some deep understanding, that students have some understanding of this. So we regularly, and I've done this, I'm sure Rachel and others have done this as well, from students from the very youngest of ages to the very oldest of ages, graduate students, teachers, asking them, what's the difference between history and the past? And that provocation, that idea of having to think differently about these two things can generate some really interesting understandings, okay? So generally the case when we ask them, young students I say, well, what's the past? And they say, well, the past, and they start thinking about it. We use it in a sentence to highlight these examples. They think, well, the past is everything that happened before this moment. I mean, this moment right now. I mean, right now, what I just said, everything, every thought, every action, every step, everything that we can ever imagine. So I asked them, well, could you ever tell a history of the past? They say, no, it's infinite. It's almost too big. It's impossible to be able to do that. So this key understanding is really essential here, that history is not the past. The past is everything that ever happened. It no longer exists. We can't retrieve it. I ask students, can we ever recreate a historical event? Could you recreate your family dinner last night? Could you recreate the winning goal or the dance recital or the music performance? No, we couldn't exactly get everything quite right. The past is disorganized. It's not organized into a story. All we have left are evidence and remnants left over. Well, history is very different. It's a small sampling. It's organized through story, through a narrative, a cognitive construct that we use to make sense of our own lives. It involves the analysis of evidence of past events, and that we know that historians are very particular about what they select, okay? Now, a few other essential understandings. We know that students are coming to history classes not as blank slates. They have a tremendous amount of knowledge that they bring with them. Knowledge about how the world works, okay? How people are likely to behave, but also how we know what we know about the past, what we call epistemology, okay? So the idea here is that students are not coming empty-handed to class. However, that teachers play a really key role. If we don't know what ideas students are bringing to our class, if we don't know what deep understandings they have, but also the misconceptions that they have, then it's going to be very difficult for us to advance their thinking as they go along. So if they think the past is just the facts of the past, that there's only one true story, all of these particular things, it's going to shape the way that they understand it. So when they get confronted with different narratives, what do they think? Oh, well, one has to be true. One is factual and the other one is a lie, or other kinds of ideas. So another couple key understandings is history is constructed from evidence. This is what separates it from fiction, right? We have all sorts of different, I just pasted some things here and artifacts, census records, maps, photographs, old history textbooks, newspapers, telegrams, wills, cemetery records. I mean, the list goes on and on. Alan Sears told me a great line this week. He said that, so somewhere he wrote that a historian wrote that historians are omnivores in the types of evidence that they're analyzing. They're always looking for new things, whether it be clothing or other ideas. So we construct our understanding from evidence, our interpretation of evidence, and what we include or exclude in our narratives changes the stories that we tell. Okay. And lastly, we know history is partial and selective. I can't tell even the whole history of, immigration to Vancouver. I can't tell the whole history. It's partial and selective. I've got to select particular stories, particular sources of evidence. Now, similar to this, and I actually found this morning, this Calvin and Hobbes idea is we hear a lot in society now, whether it be about statues being torn down, about revisionist history, right? And what we argue is that there's no such thing as one true history, right? There's not one account of Louis Riel or something that's going to last for all time. So in this sense, we know that history is revisionist. We're regularly revising our interpretations of the past. So one of the key understandings that we want students to understand is why? Why do narratives differ? Why can historians or students or teachers analyze similar sources of evidence but arrive at very different understandings, very different interpretations? Well, we know that we're living in the present, telling stories and telling history about the past. So we respond as new social, economic, cultural, and political issues and values and ideas emerge. We revise our interpretations. New evidence emerges, new theoretical framework. So as I always say to students, so for example, we know that there was LGBTQ plus people in ancient civilizations, right? Well, there's only been histories of this being written in the last years. Well, why is that? Well, it wasn't that these stories were, they were hidden or other kinds of pieces. It's that because the society in the present has changed, we've asked very different questions and focused on very different aspects of the past. Okay. So I'm going to just pause for a second. That's a pretty fast and furious introduction. Is there any comments or questions or thoughts that people have at this particular moment? So is there anything, it could be things that you connect to in your own understanding. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it looks like there's no comments or questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay.
Oh, there's one. Would the two books posted be important?
The two one, like the Sarah Mazza book here. Yeah, I mean, I would suggest, well, we're going to talk about more about historical thinking resources. This Sarah Mazza book is really great. She's a historian who's kind of writing about the history of historiography, of how history has changed over time, whether that be social history, cultural history, micro history. So it's a great introduction as a reading, but it's not necessarily something that you could take as a teaching piece at some time period. Okay.
Right. Yeah. That's
Anthony, yeah, but there's some great historical thinking ones. Anthony, do you want to maybe expand on this? Your students stop thinking about the present as the finish line. That's a really great line. I just wanted to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just go off. That's okay. Just, so I'm dealing with 10th grade, 10th graders, and oftentimes it's just built into them how they think about, I guess, if they're approaching a question or approaching a topic, and they'll come at it from the perspective of, with the internet, with Google, we know everything. We have all the answers.
Right.
We have all the tools that will help us to answer this question, but they can't really contextualize themselves within history. So it's just something that I struggle with, and I felt that it aligned with what you were speaking about here.
No, it absolutely does, and it absolutely does. It is absolutely relevant. So how do we help students understand that they're also historical actors? One of the things I was talking with someone about yesterday is this recognition that, us in the present, we're now looking at these injustices and things that happened in the past and saying, oh, that was really unfair or not right. But the interesting question is not that we're doing this like, hey, we've got it all finally figured out in 2021 and they were all wrong and idiots before that. A key question to ask students that always provokes interesting discussion is, what are we doing now that we're going to question and challenge and maybe say was unjust or unfair in 10 years, 15, 20 years down the line, right? This idea that history is constantly changing at some time period, right? But also this understanding, which I think you're also dealing with, is that history's been this story of progress over time, and we're more enlightened. We've achieved more progress now than we have at any other point in the past. Well, is that necessarily the case? Whether we look at women's rights, whether we look at treatment of Indigenous people, whether we look at injustices. So we're going to be talking about some of those things, but I think it's absolutely a crucial way, and that's a great example of understanding the misconceptions or understandings that students are bringing with them about the present and about the past at the same time. So thanks for that, Anthony. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is a framework of 6 historical thinking concepts highlighted by Peter Seixas beginning about 1996, but created, and it had several iterations over time period. You can see the 6 concepts down there, which we will discuss very quickly at the same time period. But there's a couple just key things I want to say about these concepts in general, just that we're on the same level here. So firstly, there are different models of historical thinking. Okay, and that's a really key thing. Peter is not this is not the one and only. He's got his big 6. Sam Weinberg has a very different interpretation of historical thinking, primarily only focused on evidence. This diagram in the middle is from Janet van Drie and Carla van Boxtel in the Netherlands, who've come up with this great model of historical reasoning that I think is really wonderful. Okay, so this idea that, yes, this is one of the historical thinking models that has been taken up in Canada, but it's not the only one, and it is contested. There are different views about what historical thinking is and what the concepts are that comprise it. Now, a second one is that we say that these concepts are interrelated. Over years of working with teachers and students and other ones, I've tried to come up with metaphors and analogies and ways of explaining it, and sadly, I've landed on a microscope, on a scientific example to be able to do that. And what I describe to students is, imagine that your microscope, imagine if this is how we're going to analyze history. Well, on the tray, on the slides, what we're going to actually look at through our microscope is going to be the stuff of history, events, people, developments, evidence, whatever else it might be. But imagine that the lenses that we look at the slides through are all different historical thinking concepts. So I might look at historical significance when I look at the slide. Is this event significant? What were the consequences of it? But I might also I might flip it over to look at continuity and change. Oh, is this similar or different than previous times in the past? I might make an ethical judgment about it. Was this right or wrong or good or bad in terms of history? So we switch these different lenses to try and understand these different pieces, okay? So regularly in classes, we hear things in education that says, oh, learning history, you need to just, don't worry about history. They have it all on their phone now. They can just look it up. Knowledge doesn't matter. Let's teach them skills, right? Or conversely, someone on the other side says, all the skills and all those things, what they really need to know is just the content. They need to know the facts. They need to know the details, okay? I think both of these positions are problematic. And what we're saying in historical thinking is it's both. You can't think historically about nothing. We're not just building skills, right? So what in theoretical terms, what we've divided this into is what we call first and second order understanding. First order knowledge is the substance, is the stuff of history, concepts, facts, propositions, all of those ideas. And the second order are these, what we call disciplinary concepts, continuity and change, the 6 concepts that we highlighted. Well, one can't exist without the other. I can't understand the content without a deep understanding of the second order concepts and vice versa, okay? Paul, I do see your question here. Let's hold that for the questions at the very end. Absolutely, but what I do appreciate about your comment here is that absolutely different provinces have interpreted the historical thinking model outlined by Seixas very differently. So in BC, it's almost a direct adaptation of Seixas's model. In Ontario, they focus on 4 concepts, but left out evidence and interpretation, although it is included in a different model, and the ethical dimension is not included at all. Quebec's history and citizenship framework has a very different take and don't even use the exact wording of the Seixas model at the same time period. So we absolutely see different provincial and territorial curricula taking on these different pieces, okay? The other thing I'd say about historical thinking concepts is, and I hear this regularly out, is that they're not skills. They're not just individual things like I'm going to learn how to make a a bat on a lathe or something like that, like, or I'm going to learn how to ride a bicycle. It involves a huge amount of knowledge. I need to know declarative knowledge. I need to know things about these concepts, but I also need to know how to apply these concepts to situations, what we call procedural knowledge. But it also includes attitudes. So if we think about analyzing a primary source, I pull in background knowledge that I have about the context and the time period. Oh, I know what a primary source is. I know the kinds of questions I need to ask of the sources, but I also need certain attitudes and dispositions. Like I care for, like I care about accuracy, or I'm going to really be attentive to detail in dealing with this particular concept. Now, one of the really, really most powerful ideas I think about historical thinking concepts, and what really enabled me about 15 years ago when I first encountered them, is it provided me a common language for myself to help think about these concepts, but also to communicate and talk about history with students, right? So I work with students from the very youngest, kindergarten, primary, secondary, where we talk about significance, we talk about evidence, we talk about causes and consequences, and that it enables us to be able to discuss and talk about history. Okay. Now, assessment is a big issue. And really what we think about in assessment is absolutely we're still going to assess the accuracy of their understanding, right? The understanding that they have of, is it accurate, their understanding of the Winnipeg General Strike, or how women got the right to vote, or whatever else it might be. Absolutely, we're going to assess their content. But we also want to assess their thinking, their reasoning, their ability, what we say, to negotiate justifiable solutions to historical problems and questions. We ask them an inquiry question. There might be several plausible responses. What will determine a plausible from an implausible one? Well, is it based on evidence? Is the evidence accurate and relevant to the question that we're asking? Is the answer that we have overall, is their conclusion somewhat reasonable? Okay. Now, we can also, a lot of us are social studies teachers and history teachers. So in Alberta, which is really a social studies province, these historical thinking concepts can also be adapted and have been adapted to different disciplinary concepts. So we talk about historical significance in the discipline of history. We can talk about spatial significance in geography. We could talk about economic significance or political currency or significance at the same time, or we can talk about this in a disciplinary way. Okay. So our last big idea here before we talk about the concepts is, and Peter has always been really clear in talking about these, is that, look, these concepts and the power of these concepts is, when I was first learning them and didn't have a lot of disciplinary understanding about what history is and how it worked and the nature of it, that all of a sudden that these concepts highlighted for me and gave me a language, as we're talking about, but helped me understand these fundamental problems that teachers, I think, why they've connected to historical thinking is even people with little history background sees these concepts and they know what they're talking about. Oh yeah, I know what this is, or I have this idea about this, and puts it together in a way that they understand. But one of the beautiful things, and I would call it elegant being in its simplicity, is as you begin working with these concepts, they get increasingly more complicated. That you understand that, well, okay, when we're deciding what caused an event to happen, these are dealing fundamental problems with doing history overall. Okay, again, so let's pause for a quick second here. Let me check my time and how we're doing here. We're doing okay. All right, so let me just quickly walk through the 6 concepts. So historical significance, and what I'm going to just do is talk about the specific problem. So the problem is with historical significance, we can't remember, learn, or study everything that ever happened. When we write curriculum, or when ministries write curriculum, they have to make decisions about what students need to know, right? When we're teachers, we interpret the curriculum and we make decisions from the curriculum and say, what do we think is most important to highlight? What aspects do we want to spend the most amount of time with? So historical significance exists at every level. Historians are also doing the exact same thing, right? Where they say, of this topic that I'm focusing on, what specific aspects am I focusing on? So what we want students to do is develop really justifiable methods to make decisions about historical significance and to invite them to think about this particular problem. Evidence and interpretation, the use and analysis of primary and secondary sources to construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct what we call historical interpretations, or the synonym for that is narrative. So what I've included on this particular sheet, for example, is is from the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. I think I saw it there in 2017. This is a pictograph from Chief Pasqua that was created in 1883, 9 years after the signing of Treaty 4 in 1874. Okay, so he drew this. This is his drawing of treaty commissioners, and this is his way of documenting what was agreed to, what happened, and what are the understandings of what these numbered treaty negotiations were all about. Okay, so we want to invite students to think about the past that's no longer here, to examine the records, to examine the evidence and things that exist at the same time. Okay. Continuity and change. How do we make sense of the complex course of history? How do we organize it into chronology or sequence? How do we understand, is change good or is change bad? Is continuity good? Is continuity bad? Have things gotten better over time in living standards, in rights, in labor, labor rights, women's rights, or have they gotten worse, or have they stayed the same? So we want to invite students to make this, to make these types of judgments, and it deals with the issue of historical time. Now, the image that was chosen for these posters for this particular one is one that a lot of people are familiar with. Thomas More from the Regina Industrial School. I believe it was from a government report in 1897. Now, I love this image to highlight this concept, because students at a very simple level can look at the photo on the left and look at the photo on the right and identify aspects of continuity and change in the photos. But what I always highlight to teachers and students as well is, let's think meta about this at the same time period. Let's think about what these photos were created for, and how we interpret our interpretation of these photos has changed over time. So for example, this was created in 1897 as a way for the government to show the success of residential schools. Look, we took this wild child in this bottom left-hand corner. We took this child and we've turned him into a civilized gentleman. Look how successful residential schools are. So they were using this to look at progress, right? Well, now what's really interesting is the change in this is that we look at this photo with great sadness. Look at how you strip culture and how difficult what we know about residential schools. We see this as regress and not progress over time. So it's a great illustration of this particular idea. Cause and consequence is probably the most obvious one. A lot of history teachers, regardless of what background, say, look, I regularly am focusing with my students on what causes things to happen and what the effects or consequences that emerge from them are. Okay, so that's exactly what this is talking about. But this is thinking even deeply about individual agency. What role do individuals have and play in causing events to happen, and how do those touch and are related to the systemic conditions and factors and underlying conditions that also lead events to happen, that individuals' actions are constrained within a particular time. Historical perspectives is one of the most complicated concepts. At the very simple level, people really glom onto it and say, look, I understand this. It's about understanding that we have different perspectives of every event, that there's always going to be different historical perspectives, and we want students to understand those perspectives. And that's absolutely a key part of this concept. However, what I would say is more important to think about here is what we're really trying to get is, how did people living in times that may or may not be very different than our own right now, this notion of the past as a foreign country, how do we regularly invite students to get into the mindset and values and beliefs and worldviews that existed at different times? How do we understand what events in the past meant to people who were going through them, right? So historical perspective activity. What did the meaning of Treaty 4 mean to Chief Pasqua in 1874 when he was there? And how was it interpreted, and what did it mean to the treaty commissioners who were negotiating on behalf of the Canadian government and the Crown? And the last one, probably the most complicated ideas, I think, probably overall, is this, and the one that teachers oftentimes say, this is the one I'm really struggling with, is, and this one I've done the most research on for myself, was about the ethical dimension, right? I remember entering the classroom, hey, history is a subjective subject, and we shouldn't be making judgments about the past. We're just going to describe and explain the past, and we leave judgment to other people. Okay, but the reality is that we're regularly making ethical judgments about the past to guide our actions in the present and future. There's no historical work that I'm familiar with ever that I've read that doesn't include an ethical judgments at some level, implicitly or explicitly. So the challenge of this one is really connecting history and citizenship education. So it involves making judgments about the actions and people in the past, but it involves assigning responsibility to historical figures or contemporary individuals or groups for past actions, and deciding what our responsibility in the present is to respond to this particular piece. Okay, so that's that big one. What should we do about statues? How should we respond? Now, the key thing about the ethical dimension as well is we oftentimes think about this as being injustice as another piece, but it's also highlighting the heroes. Who should we hold up as paragons or icons in the present of people that we think are worthwhile celebrating or commemorating from the past at this particular time? All right, so the last real section here is to talk about, and I know this is the fire hose approach to this particular topic. The last piece is really about, well, what kind of shifts are we noticing in 15 years now of these ideas really being out there in Canada? What are we noticing is really important? What kind of shifts are teachers making in the classroom to embed and implement historical thinking more regularly? So the first one I would say is that we take a shift from history as information to history as disciplined inquiry. So what it really requires a history teacher to do is not just be the provider of information and knowledge at the beginning. I'm going to tell you, and this was me in my early part of my career of history teaching, the content was both the means and the end of what I was trying to do in my teaching. Okay. What we're trying to shift instead is to say, absolutely, teachers need to know a ton about their background. And the more they know, the better questions that they can actually write. But the point is not for students to regale students with this information, but it's to use their understanding of history to design and conduct. I love this idea of teachers as conductors of historical inquiries that regularly invite students to have to think historically. So how can we do that? How do we shift this role away from this particular position? Secondly, how do we identify historical topics and issues that are relevant and engaging in students' lives, right? It's a truism in social studies and history teaching. Hey, you need to make history relevant. You need to make social studies relevant. You need to engage students. But the question I always ask my students to think about is, well, what makes something relevant? And what is relevant? Does relevant mean that it's only something that students are interested in? Does relevant mean that it's happening now? So it's things that students are aware of in their present lives and daily lives, that we need to really think about that. So the examples I've used here are Black Lives Matter and the climate crisis. But my historian friends have been telling me that this fall, one of the things that they really noticed students asking a lot of questions about is about Afghanistan, right? Some of the students that are in our undergraduate classes right now, absolutely in our K-12 classes, were not alive when 9/11 happened. They don't have the same background or understanding of what happened. And so given the events that happened in the summertime, they're really trying to process and understand this. Why did Canada go to the war there? What were they trying to do? Was it a success or a failure? What were the consequences of this? How do I understand what's the future going to look like in Afghanistan? Asking these types of questions. Okay. Now, another big shift is that we create inquiry questions connected to one of those earlier slides that we had. How do we create inquiry questions that problematize history and invite reasoned judgment and not researching? And I use that word researching, like to search again, to just go and find other people's conclusions. So rather than getting students to list the similarities and differences between Canada in 1900 and today, all we do is a minor shift in that question is that we say, was Canada in 1900 more similar or more different than Canada? That they have to make a reasoned judgment. Oh, I want you to memorize the consequences or the causes of the Great Depression. Which consequences of the Great Depression had the greatest impact on society at that particular time period? So these are very different kinds of questions. Now, what I always say to students and my student teachers and teachers about this is these historical thinking concepts work on two levels. We want students to increase their understanding of them and use these concepts to be able as tools to interrogate the past, right? And there, I always imagine it's like providing a tool belt to throughout their lives that they use these different tools to make sense of the history that is around them, that they see on vacation, that they hear stories from family and other things. On a second level, though, these historical thinking concepts are used by teachers to organize curriculum and to design inquiries. So as you can see on this slide, I've highlighted how each historical thinking concept can be used to frame inquiry questions. The challenge I say to my pre-service teachers that I'm teaching right now is I say, I'd love you to design an inquiry question. If you can design an inquiry question that doesn't focus on a historical thinking concept, you win a prize, right? And no one's done it yet. No one has been able to write a question that doesn't explicitly deal with one of these 6 concepts overall, okay? So, and then keeping that in mind, a lot of teachers in making this shift and saying, oh, I want to implement historical thinking, but I feel like I have to redo everything, or I feel like I need to design these giant units or my entire course, and that's a lot of work, and I'm not even sure if it's going to work. And I love that question, because I think it's really important that teachers are going to be skeptical, about the different models and new ideas that are coming around. What I always advise to students is, or to teachers, is to start small, right? And increase the size and scale of inquiry over time, okay? So I'm a big believer, we can do inquiry in 10 minutes. I can show a photograph on the projector on the front of the screen. I can invite students to identify to offer plausible solutions about what's happening in the photograph. I can ask them to make judgments about why the photographer took that particular photograph, right? And we can do that in 5 or 10 minutes. We can analyze a political cartoon, as you can see in this example, but we can scale that up. I can move towards a single lesson level inquiry. I can do a multi-lesson sequence that, okay, well, we're going to look at the Battle of Seven Oaks and we're going to look at different sources, and you have to construct a narrative about what happened and who fired first, or whatever else it might be. We can get, though, to unit level inquiries and course level inquiries. And the size and scale differs on how much evidence I bring in, how big the questions are in terms of geography, how big of an area, how long of a time period, right? And what kind of product I'm asking, or performance I'm asking students to produce at the very end of it, okay? So one of the big challenges as well, how do we adapt and assemble multiple sources of historical evidence that are accessible to students, okay? So one of the things I always say to teachers is, don't throw out your resources, all your old textbooks, your outdated resources, the things that you feel aren't great anymore. We can use those as tools or as evidence to be able to inquire into. I love using old history textbook. Ruth Sandwell talks about the idea of teaching against the textbook. So what we do is, if we have a problematic textbook, what we, instead of just saying, of teaching it, oh, this is the truth, study this textbook, we're going to teach against it and say, oh, well, this is an inaccurate textbook. What 5 changes would you make to this textbook to make it more valid, more accurate, more plausible, right? This history is really exclusive. What are these textbook pages? I'd like you to suggest 3 images and 5 changes to the text that's going to make a more inclusive history, okay? So we also need to scaffold student inquiry. So for example, so one of the things that I've talked to teachers a lot about is that there's a lot of misconceptions. As I mentioned, I'm working with the Seven Oaks School District right now in Winnipeg, and we've talked a lot about what inquiry is, right? And a lot of people have misconceptions on both sides, right? So some people like to portray inquiry as being discovery learning. Oh yeah, you just pose a question and then let students loosen, and they're on their own to answer the question, to find the evidence, to do all of these particular things. Now, I don't know anyone who has pedagogy based on inquiry practices that uses discovery learning, right? But on the other side, it's also not, we use these caricatures of, oh, traditional classrooms, oh, the students are in rows and they're just learning and memorizing and regurgitating information. Both of these binary positions are really problematic. But what we know about inquiry is that regardless if I'm doing inquiry in English, in science, in math, in social studies, in history, it has certain elements. We ask a question, we identify relevant sources of evidence, we have to analyze that evidence and draw conclusions, and then we have to represent and communicate our findings. There's not so many, there is this standard kind of elements to it. But what we're suggesting to people is that we need teachers to be thinking about the degree of what we call the locus of control, okay? If I have students who have never done inquiry before, and my students in my class say, Lindsay, I'm really struggling. I'm going to classes in BC and we're using inquiry practices. I don't think I've ever had a teacher that used inquiry to teach history. So I'm really having a tough time thinking about it. So the exact same point that we make is, if we go into a classroom and think that everything is going to be student directed, that they're going to develop their own questions, they're going to identify their sources, they're going to do all those things on their own without support, the quality of the inquiry is going to be substantially lower, right? And so what I always say to teachers is, the the quality of inquiry, the quality of the assignment and the inquiry that they're doing does not depend on how independent or not it is. It depends on the quality of thinking elicited. So we suggest to teachers is, at every level and every element of this inquiry, I think about the degree to which I want this to be teacher directed, shared, or student directed. So if my students are really good at writing questions, I might get them to develop their own inquiry questions. We've facilitated and built this over time. But if they have no experience doing that, I might provide them with a question, or I might provide them with a few questions and get them to choose one, or that they can develop their own at the same time. And we say the same thing about evidence and analyzing it and representing it, right? So we change that scale and scope, okay? And we can gradually, as you can see here, this is an inquiry that we did for the Ontario curriculum around the 1890 to 1914 period. You can see how we've linked HT lessons, historical thinking lessons over time. Here's the course question, here's the unit question, and here's the individual lessons that we included as part of that we're going to build towards answering those. So we've got an overlying question, but we also have a bunch of smaller inquiries within that are going to work towards answering that bigger overall question. Okay. And the last thing to talk about is about the assessment piece, right? What's the change? Well, we're gonna move. If we had an informational approach, we're trying to assess how well students can recall the information that we taught them about history. And I'm not saying that information is not important or that we don't ever want to assess students' understanding of historical events. Okay, but the shift we have to make in historical thinking is there may be plausible interpretations, multiple plausible interpretations of a political cartoon, of an evidence, of a historical question. So what we really want to move towards is we want to accept that there are multiple interpretations, but assess the quality of the thinking. So this is an example of just a little chart that we created for teachers on assessing students' historical significance. So what kind of things would I look for if I was observing students walking around the classroom? I'm going to look for whether or not they use criteria and they're discussing criteria when they're talking about evidence. Do they provide evidence or justification? I also have given a bunch of prompts that I might ask students if I'm engaged in conversation with one or several students at the same time period, okay? But then I also think about how I would assess students' products or demonstrations or performances of learning, about how I might judge whether or not those are going to be solid or not, okay? All right. Whew. All right, let's stop there for a minute here.
I have a question, Lindsay.
I have a couple slides left to show just about a few resources, but then we're open for conversation now and also after these next ones. So Rachel, go ahead.
I just want to know where this particular assessment piece comes from that's on this slide.
I'm going to show you this. This is from Snapshots and Time resources that we created.
Oh, awesome.
So I'll show you where this is. I'll show you where this is from in a second. So is there any other questions about anything that I've raised so far? I mean, as I apologize, it has been the fire hose approach. So what we've talked about so far is what the rationale for historical thinking is, what are some key understandings about historical thinking, what are these 6 concepts, and how might I implement these in the classroom? So there's been a lot, and I know this is just a surface level dive into kind of giving you a map of some of the key areas of historical thinking. Okay, well, we'll just show you a couple of resources and then we can stop and talk for 5 or 10 minutes at the very end as well. So these are just some resources. At the bottom of the screen, you can see there's a site on the TC Squared website called Thinking About History, okay? And which you can see at the very top, what it looks like. And included in these are a variety of, most of them free, but also some are behind paywall, but most of them are free. Resources to support elementary and secondary students in using historical thinking and inquiry. So one of the first ones that you see here is we created a series of 6 videos that are meant to unpack, they're like 5 to 7 minute videos, one for each of the 6 historical thinking concepts to help unpack what these concepts are. And they're all related to a particular historical event. Some of them are about Chinese Canadian history, some of them are about World War I internment, and some of them are actually about the great unsolved mysteries in Canadian history. Now, we've also included lesson plans for grades 6 to 8. I think those could be adapted for elementary age students. and also grade 9 to 12 about that you could use lesson plans for introducing the videos, for teaching about them, and for reflecting later on. A variety of really good activities to do that. We've also created 12 tools recently called Inquiring into Local Indigenous History. These are teaching tools around that are related to each of the 6 historical thinking concepts. So for example, how would one of the lessons is, assessing the historical significance of an event or person. Another one is evaluating a commemoration in your community. Another one is talking to and learning from elders. So there's a variety of different kinds of activities that would be, and these include PDFs, the Blackline Masters, assessment tools, all of these things, all freely available as well, focused on the different concepts. I haven't worked on this project in a long time, but this was kind of my baby, I would say 10 years ago. We wanted to create a collection of history docs, what we called a searchable collection of curated, carefully selected primary and secondary sources focused on key events in Canadian history that are taught in different provinces and territories all across Canada. And what we've created is a curated set of about 8 to 10 primary sources and some secondary sources, but they also are built on an inquiry question. So a teacher could give the inquiry question and then decide, do you want to analyze a bunch of these sources or only a few of them? Do I want students working in groups or not? What tools am I going to teach students to unpack these different pieces of evidence? These are also really helpful as well, okay? 3 years ago, we wrote a revised and expanded edition of Teaching Historical Thinking, which you can see on the left. This includes, it's a very, if you're looking for theoretical work, this isn't it. This is a very practical, teacher-oriented book. It includes tons of examples. How would you introduce these concepts to students? What kind of activities you'd use to teach them over time? It includes a variety of Blackline Masters and other things at the same time. The exemplars in historical thinking are some lessons around giving you examples of exemplar lessons for how you would go about teaching different historical thinking concepts, and they're focused on different topics in Canadian history, okay? And the last one, which I'm most excited about at this particular time, because we've been working on this over the last couple of years, is what we call Snapshots in Time, or Cliché d'Histoire. So this idea, what we basically did, and you can see the website down below, I'm just going to show you a few things on the website. So we've created sets of cards focused on 50 significant events in Canadian history. Set 1, which you can see on the left here, is focused on sort of the big 50 events that are really commonly known, well-known big events, World War II, World War I, things that people know about in Canadian history, okay? Set 2 in the middle there is the next 50 events that are important, really significant, but not as big as maybe some of the events in set 1 that we would know about, that we want to highlight those. Set 3 we created was meant to be an adapted version. This is reduced text, increased image size. These are designed for could be struggling readers, English language learners, younger students, all of those different things. And they focus also on 50 events. Most of the 50 events are from set 1 and some of them are from set 2. And I'll show you just an image of what they look like. So this is what set 1 cards look like. You can see on the front, there's a title, there's a little description, and then we've chosen an image, and that could be a map, which you see. It could be a secondary source drawing. It could be a photograph from the time period. And the idea is that the images on the card provide hints and clues about the event and about when the event happened, okay? When you flip the cards over, on the back of the card, you can see it still has the title and a smaller thumbnail of the image, but also more descriptive text about the particular event, and then you see the date of the event, okay? Very similar we see for set 2. So, rather than focusing on World War I, we see things like the conscription crisis. We see events like the Meech Lake Accord, and you can see the same kind of design overall. And then what we did with set 3 is you can see there's less text on the card, so only a title, larger images at that time period. But one of the things that we think that we're most excited about with this particular set is that on the back of each of these cards, I worked with historians through the Wilson Institute of Canadian History at McMaster University, and we developed inquiry questions that we thought were really central to each of the issues. So those inquiry questions could be used by a teacher to raise an inquiry that the class then investigates about that particular event, or the student could use the inquiry themselves and do their own inquiry depending on the topics that they actually have, okay? So to support teachers in doing that, we have created a bunch of games. So one of the things that we do with the games is a sequencing game. So how to build a timeline using the card. And we've created a competitive game, which some students enjoy, some don't. A cooperative game, where students have to work together to build this timeline and make it as accurate chronologically as possible, and also an individual game. So the game is like, okay, we sequence these, you play with a certain number of cards in your hand, you're trying to build an accurate timeline of significant events in Canadian history. So to do that, though, to support teachers in teaching and assessing historical thinking, we've created 4 tools right now, and we're adding more. Hopefully each month we're adding a few new tools to go at the same time period. And you can see that they focus on different historical thinking concepts. So we've got one about contextualizing sources, assessing significance in the timeline, and assessing progress and decline in a timeline. Have things improved or gotten worse over time? And we've included PDF instructions. What do the PDFs include? They include full inquiry instructions of how you would launch the inquiry, introduce the model, give students a chance to practice, to check their understanding, to apply the learning, and then to assess and reflect on their understanding at the very end of it. So the contextualizing card is all about, how do we know who was involved in the event, what happened, where did the event take place, and when did it take place, from looking at an image on the front of a card. And we make observations and inferences from that. The idea being is, these are the tools, the contextualization tools that we teach are what's needed to be able to build a timeline. So if I gave students, for example, these 9 cards that are all centered around events that occurred from 1870s and 1885, and said, okay, here's these events, what kind of tools, what kind of clues and things would they pull on from contextualizing these cards to be able to sequence these things? So as a teacher, how would I assess these beyond the fact that, okay, you got your timeline in the right order, but what kind of tools are they using? What kind of inferences are they making to arrive at those? And we've also included for each of these an assessment tool that students self-assess their own understanding or peer assess their own understanding, but also, as Rachel was asking, these supporting teacher observations. Supporting teacher assessment. So if I wanted to observe things, if I wanted to engage in a conversation with students, or I wanted to assess a demonstration of learning. All right. Whew. All right, that's a lot. Well, we got some time left, so that's it. The only other thing I wanted to mention is we are, and Rachel kindly mentioned this at the very beginning, I've been hosting historical thinking institutes for over a decade in different cities all across Canada. Because of COVID, we went to a virtual historical thinking institute. Generally, we did this over 1 week of the summer. We decided this year, let's do this 1 per month for 8 months. So we've hosted 2 sessions already. We did an introduction, which you basically got today. On October 13th, we talked about significance, but we have upcoming sessions in November, December, January, February, March, and April. It's $105 for the entire 8 sessions. So even, for example, if you thought, hey, you know what, this sounds great, I'm really interested in this, you've only missed 2 sessions, you'd easily be able to catch up. We have about 150 in the English group and 50 in the French group at the same time period. It's been tremendous, the conversations and breakouts and things that we've been facilitating along the way. And for $105 for still 6 sessions, plus you get your choice of a TC squared book like the ones I highlighted to you, or a set of snapshots and time cards, we think it's a pretty good deal overall. So if you're interested in that, by all means, you can email me, or I've included the Canada's History registration there, and Brooke or Kylie at Canada's History will be able to facilitate that as well. All right, sorry about that. So that's a lot of info.
I'm going to jump in here really quickly too. I think I see a couple Alberta names, but for anybody from Alberta, we will actually cover the registration fee for the conference. So I'll type in my email address so that people can contact.
Everyone's going to pretend that they're from Alberta, Jennifer.
Yeah, right. I'm definitely from Alberta, Jen.
Are you registered in my council? Yeah, so ATASSC, the Social Studies Council President at gmail.com. We will also be sending cards to any Alberta people that are registered at the conference. And we also have books available for people. So if people want to get any of the TC squared books, again, email me. We want to get resources in teachers' hands. So
thank you. Thanks to Alberta for doing it. I didn't know that. That's an incredible support.
Yeah.
So anyways, we have a few minutes left, and I'm also happy to hang around afterwards. I know people have other sessions, but we have some time to take some questions or to field some comments or other kinds of things. So please share away. And it doesn't have to be a question. It could just be a comment. It could be a connection to your own practice. It could be a struggle that you're having, any of these things. And Rachel is also exceedingly knowledgeable. So I could actually get her to take these questions.
Yeah, you know what? Not seeing any questions yet, but if we don't have questions, there was one of your slides where I was like, oh, I have some things to say about that, or a question, but now it's gone. The fire hose is keep
we
going.
Can go through the 50 slide. You want me to take a quick run through the 50
it's
and
totally
see if I can jog
fine. I am really excited about these assessment frameworks. I think they're going to be really helpful for the beginning teachers that I teach as well. So
yeah.
But
well, thanks. I'm just looking at the chat here. Thanks, Kiara and Cheryl. I'm glad it was really helpful. I apologize. It's like as an inquiry teacher to talk for 55 minutes straight is not necessarily practicing what I preach, but this was definitely a surface level introduction. So the Virtual Historical Thinking Institute, we've tried to do these where we have 2 breakout groups scheduled throughout, that we get teachers talking to other teachers from across Canada and building some knowledge for 2 kind of 15-minute sessions. So it's not all, by the way, it's not just all didactic teaching.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say was a little bit more around the connection between the ethical dimension and sort of how it plays out in the Ontario curriculum, because that's sort of been my experience.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Like the evidence is not, like we only in the Ontario curriculum adopted, the four historical thinking concepts directly and explicitly within the curriculum. But in terms of our A strands and inquiry process, evidence is right in there. As somebody who's done writing in our curriculum, like we've built in the kinds of questions into the curriculum, the sample questions that are evidence related and related to the ethical dimension. And the way I always saw it in my classroom was like, like the evidence kind of gets us started. Like that's where we start. The 4 in the middle are kind of the ones that you're using to kind of figure out what to do with the evidence. And then the ethical dimension is sort of what you do with it at the end, right? Like, what do we do now that we understand more about the past, and what are our responsibilities as citizens? Like you said, there's a really strong citizenship connection, which, it's embedded in everybody's curriculum. And what do we do now? And I think that's usually the question that I get sort of my grade 10s kind of started with, or, working with in grade 7, 8 as well. And then kind of getting into these, more tricky judgments in my senior classes with the ethical dimension. Yeah.
And that's really great. I mean, that's really highlighting a couple of things. I mean, firstly, what I always show, why I had evidence as the middle of those 6 concepts too, is that every single one of these concepts requires evidence and interpretation. If I'm making an argument about significance, I'm using evidence. But the evidence concept is like specifically like, hey, we're focusing on making judgments about evidence, about different kinds of evidence. And exactly, Rachel, as you said, the ethical dimension is the sort of so what? It's the action part of the inquiry. Like, what do I do now? What's the response to this? And that's the hard thing, is that all of these are interpretations. We're telling stories about continuity and change. We're making interpretations about significance. We're making interpretations about these. And the same thing with the ethical dimension. What are we, how do we, now that we know this, how do we respond now that we understand who is responsible for this? Absolutely. And I wasn't meaning also to criticize the Ontario curriculum for it. I think people have adapted.
I don't mean to be an apologist for the Ontario
and you're not an
apologist
either. I don't think that.
But yeah, no, it is true. I mean, we only adopted 4 very explicitly. So they do kind of get, integrated in different ways. But I know, most of our OHASTA folks, do love to have all 6 of those posters in their classrooms. Jen, where are we at on time?
So officially we are done. And so I think, like I just saw somebody pop into the waiting room, and I think what they're doing is they might be jumping in early for the next session, because I think the links for the
okay. Because I think I have a different link for my next session though, or is it the same link?
I don't know. You
I have a separate
leave
email.
this
Anyways,
one and then come back in on the other.
Here's what I'm going to do though, is that, I mean, we absolutely, let's close the session. I know people have places to go and things to do.
Yep.
I'm happy to just hang out here for a little bit. If anyone wants to ask any questions, I can hang around for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll leave this room and I'm going to come back. I'm doing another similar set, well, the exact same session, although better this time. Although better, I got a trial run through in half an hour. So
Lindsay, you'll actually be in
anyway.
the same room, so you're welcome to stay here.
Oh, I'm
thanks,
welcome to
Kalinda.
Okay. Oh,
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
thanks.
And
Yeah,
Jen,
Lindsay, we pay people because they're way smarter than us with tech. So we've
Okay, that's perfect.
the tech's
and
good.
Jen, I was thinking you should post your Alberta offer in the general chat on the platform, just to kind of
Okay.
I know you're trying hard to spend money over there. So,
and where do I do that?
Oh gosh. Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, thanks everyone for
And if you
coming, and
post
thanks
it
for all
in
the
here, I'll
speakers.
post it.
Yeah.
And thanks to the support from Jen and Rachel and our tech people as well for making this very smooth.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much,
Lindsay.
Lindsay.
Thanks.